Millionaire kicked his pregnant wife. Out of the house 20 years later, she visited him, but imagine standing in the middle of a bustling New York City street where skyscrapers pierce the clouds and dreams seem as big as the skyline itself. Now picture this. A young woman named Emily, clutching her stomach protectively, walks out of a luxurious penthouse into the freezing night with tears streaming down her face. Her crime? Being pregnant with the child of James Crawford, one of the wealthiest men in the city. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a tale of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. It's also about how fate has a way of bringing people back together when they least expect it, 20 years later, to be exact. Emily had once believed in love. She fell for James not because of his money, but because he seemed different beneath all that power and ambition. But on that cold evening, she learned the hard truth. James valued wealth over everything else, even family. When Emily told him about the baby growing inside her, his reaction was nothing short of cruel. He accused her of trapping him, called her a gold digger, and handed her a check like she could be bought off. With no choice left, Emily stepped out into the world alone, determined to give her unborn child a life filled with love, even if it meant doing it without help from anyone, especially James. Fast forward 2 decades, and Emily is no longer the fragile woman who walked out of that penthouse. She's become a symbol of strength, raising her son Daniel with grit and grace, despite every obstacle life threw at her. Meanwhile, James continued building his empire, amassing more wealth than most could dream of. But at what cost? His marriages ended in bitterness. His other children barely spoke to him, and deep down, he carried regrets he never dared to confront. And then came the day Daniel stumbled upon the name Crawford Enterprises while walking through Manhattan. Curiosity burned within him, leading him to uncover the truth about the father who had abandoned them. What happens next changes everything for both Daniel and James. The heart of this story lies in its characters. Emily represents unconditional love and sacrifice, showing us what it means to rise above pain and build something beautiful out of broken pieces. Daniel embodies determination and kindness, growing up to become someone who doesn't need validation from anyone, not even the man who should have been there for him. And James? He's a complex figure, flawed and selfish, yet undeniably human. His journey forces us to ask tough questions. Can someone truly change after years of making bad choices? Is forgiveness possible when wounds run so deep? These themes resonate deeply because they reflect real-life struggles many of us face, whether it's dealing with abandonment, rebuilding trust, or finding closure. Now let's talk about the moment Daniel decides to meet James. You can almost feel the tension in the air as he steps into the towering office building, owned by Crawford Enterprises. For years, he imagined confronting his father, demanding answers, maybe even seeking revenge. But reality turns out to be far more complicated. James isn't the same arrogant businessman he used to be. Instead, Daniel finds a man weighed down by age, illness, and regret. Their conversation leaves Daniel grappling with emotions he didn't anticipate: anger, confusion, and perhaps even a flicker of sympathy. Yet the encounter ends on an unresolved note, leaving viewers wondering, will Daniel forgive his father before it's too late, or will pride and pain keep them apart forever? What makes this story unforgettable is how relatable it feels. We've all faced moments in life where we've questioned our worth, doubted others' intentions, or struggled to let go of the past. Emily's fight to provide for her child reminds us of the lengths parents go to ensure their kids have better lives. Daniel's internal conflict mirrors the struggles of anyone trying to reconcile with a difficult parent. And James's late life remorse serves as a poignant reminder that success without meaningful connections is hollow. Through these characters, we're invited to explore universal truths about love, loss, and second chances. As the story unfolds, you'll find yourself rooting for Emily, admiring Daniel's resilience, and perhaps even feeling conflicted about James. The twists and turns will keep you hooked, making you wonder what happens next. Does Daniel finally find peace with his father? Does James get the redemption he so desperately seeks? And most importantly, does Emily ever get the justice she deserves? There are no easy answers here, only raw, authentic emotions that tug at your heartstrings. By now, you might be asking yourself, why should I care about these characters? Because their story reflects our own battles with forgiveness, identity, and legacy. It challenges us to think about the choices we make and the impact they have on those around us. Whether you're a parent, a child, or simply someone navigating relationships, this narrative offers valuable lessons wrapped in a gripping plot. So grab some popcorn, settle in, and prepare to dive into a story that will stay with you long after the credits roll. And just when you think you know where things are headed, the story takes another unexpected turn. Remember that hospital room scene, the one where Daniel visits James during his final days. That moment alone raises more questions than answers. Why did Daniel decide to visit again? What did James reveal during their conversations? And how does Emily fit into all of this? Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned for the next part of this emotional roller coaster, where secrets unravel, hearts mend or break, and destinies collide in ways no one saw coming. The weight of James's confession hung heavy in the air, each word like a stone dropped into an already turbulent ocean. Daniel sat there, gripping the edge of the chair, as if it might anchor him to reality. He had spent his entire life building walls around this man, this name that represented betrayal and pain, and now those walls were crumbling under the sheer force of vulnerability. James wasn't just speaking, he was unraveling himself, piece by fragile piece, revealing a version of his father Daniel had never imagined existed. A scared, broken man who had chosen fear over love, control over connection. But understanding didn't come easily. Not when every fiber of Daniel's being screamed at him to walk away. His mind raced back to all the moments he wished he'd had a father. Birthdays celebrated alone with only his mother's quiet strength. School plays where other kids waved excitedly at their dads, sitting in the audience. Late nights spent wondering why no one cared enough to stay. Those memories weren't erased by apologies or explanations. They still burned, raw and unrelenting. Yet here he was, sitting across from the source of so much pain, unable to leave. Something inside him refused to turn his back completely, even though every instinct told him to do exactly that. As days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself caught between two worlds. On one side was the life he had built, the career he poured his heart into, the friendships he cherished, and most importantly, his mother, Olivia, whose resilience had been the foundation of everything good in his life. She had raised him, not just as her son, but as her partner, teaching him values James could never have instilled. Her love was unconditional, unwavering, while James's felt tainted, conditional on timelines and regrets. When Daniel finally told her about visiting James, she listened quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've made my peace with him," she said softly, "but I trust you to make your own choices." On the other side was the complicated pull toward James. Their meetings became more frequent, though they never grew easy. Conversations oscillated between tense silences and bursts of honesty, often leaving Daniel drained yet strangely unsettled. James shared stories Daniel had never heard before. About his own childhood, growing up in a household devoid of affection, ruled by cold expectations and rigid traditions. It wasn't an excuse, James admitted, but maybe an explanation for why. He had repeated the same patterns. "I didn't know how to be what you needed," James confessed one evening, his voice cracking. "All I knew was how to run." Meanwhile, Daniel's professional life began to intersect unexpectedly with his personal turmoil. The startup he co-founded with Michael was gaining traction faster than anyone anticipated, attracting attention from investors and media alike. One day, during a high-profile meeting, a journalist casually mentioned James Crawford's name, probing for details about Daniel's background. Daniel froze mid-sentence. The room suddenly too bright, too loud. For years he had worked tirelessly to ensure his success stood apart from his father's legacy, to prove he wasn't defined by abandonment. But now, faced with questions he couldn't escape, he realized how deeply intertwined their lives remained, whether he liked it or not. The tension reached its peak when Daniel discovered a letter among James's belongings, a letter addressed to him, dated shortly after his birth. In it, James wrote about the night Emily left, describing the crushing regret that hit him soon as the door closed behind her. He admitted he had wanted to chase after her, to apologize, but pride and fear held him back. Reading those words felt like stepping into quicksand. Daniel wanted to reject them entirely, to dismiss them as hollow attempts at redemption, but the handwriting was shaky. Unlike the confident strokes he associated with James's business empire, it spoke of a man wrestling with demons, far darker than wealth or power. And then came the day Daniel realized James's health was deteriorating rapidly. The once formidable businessman now struggled to sit upright without assistance. His breathing labored, his voice barely audible. During one visit, Daniel arrived to find James staring out the window, his gaze distant. "Do you remember Central Park?" James asked suddenly, startling Daniel. "That night, your mother walked out, and I watched her go. I thought I was protecting my world, but really, I destroyed it." His voice broke, and for the first time, Daniel saw tears in his father's eyes. It was in that moment that Daniel understood the full scope of the tragedy, not just for himself and his mother, but for James as well. This man, who had seemed invincible, was now stripped bare, reduced to nothing more than regrets and borrowed time. And despite everything, despite the anger and resentment that still simmered beneath the surface, Daniel couldn't ignore the humanity staring back at him. As much as he wanted to hold on to his hatred, he knew it wouldn't change the past. What mattered now was what he chose to carry forward. The final confrontation loomed closer with each passing hour. Daniel wrestled with the decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. Should he forgive James? Could forgiveness even exist without reconciliation? Or was it better to let go entirely, to close this chapter forever and focus on the future he had fought so hard to build? The answers eluded him, slipping through his fingers like sand. All he knew was that whatever choice he made would define not just his relationship with James, but also the kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm raging within Daniel's heart. Inside the hospital room, time seemed to slow, stretching each second into eternity. The climax of this story wasn't just about resolving old wounds. It was about deciding which scars to keep and which ones to heal. The day James Crawford passed away, Daniel felt an unexpected heaviness settle over him. It wasn't grief in the traditional sense. It was more like the finality of closure, hitting harder than he had anticipated. For years, he had carried the image of his father as a cold, unfeeling man who chose wealth over family. But now, after weeks of sitting by his bedside, hearing his regrets, and understanding the fears that drove him, Daniel realized it wasn't so black and white. James hadn't been a villain. He had been flawed, scared, and deeply human, and while that didn't excuse what he had done, it did explain it. As Daniel sorted through the journals and letters left behind, one entry stood out, dated just days before Emily walked out of their penthouse. It read, "I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I can feel it in my gut, but I don't know how to stop myself. Love feels like surrender, and I've never been good at letting go." The raw honesty in those words struck Daniel. He could almost picture his father writing them late at night, whiskey glass in hand, wrestling with emotions he didn't know how to process. He decided to share these writings with his mother. When Emily arrived at his apartment later that week, she looked around cautiously, sensing something was different. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly as she sat down on the couch. Daniel handed her the journal without a word. She hesitated for a moment, then began reading. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then finally to sadness. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "He thought I was trapping him," she whispered, shaking her head. "All this time, I thought he saw me as greedy or manipulative, but really, he was just afraid." Daniel nodded, sitting beside her. "He made mistakes, Mom. So many of them. But he regretted them too. In the end, he wanted us to know that." Emily closed the journal and held it tightly against her chest. "It doesn't change what happened," she admitted. "But maybe it helps me understand why it happened." She turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his. "What about you? Do you forgive him?" Daniel exhaled slowly, thinking about all the conversations he'd had with James during those final weeks. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a journey. And while he couldn't say he fully forgave his father, he knew one thing for certain: holding on to anger wasn't serving him anymore. "I think I'm ready to let go," he said finally. "Not because he deserved it, but because I deserve peace." With that decision came a shift, not just in Daniel's heart, but in the way he viewed his own life. He no longer felt the need to prove himself against James's shadow. His success wasn't about defiance. It was about creation. Every project he worked on, every goal he achieved, was a testament to the values his mother had instilled in him: resilience, kindness, and integrity. Those were the legacies he wanted to leave behind, not bitterness or resentment. Meanwhile, Rachel called to check in, her voice warm and familiar. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Better than I expected," he replied. They talked for a while, reminiscing about the early days when Emily and Daniel first moved to Chicago. "Your mom always reminded me of a fighter," Rachel said. "She never gave up, not even when things seemed impossible." Hearing those words filled Daniel with pride. His mother wasn't just a survivor. She was a hero. In the months that followed, Daniel found himself revisiting Central Park often. It was there, surrounded by the sounds of the city and the quiet beauty of nature, that he felt closest to both his parents. One afternoon, as he strolled past the lake, he noticed a young couple arguing near a bench. The woman clutched her stomach protectively, her face streaked with tears, while the man stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Watching them, Daniel felt a pang of recognition. He remembered that night 20 years ago, when his own mother had walked out into the cold, carrying Nothing but hope and determination. He approached them cautiously, clearing his throat. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The couple turned to look at him, startled. The man opened his mouth to respond, but the woman spoke first. "We're fine," she muttered, though her voice betrayed her. Daniel hesitated, then pulled out his wallet. "Here," he said, handing her a card. "If you need anything, a place to stay, someone to talk to, call this number. My name's Daniel." As he walked away, he realized he wasn't just paying forward the kindness shown to his mother all those years ago. He was honoring her legacy, the same way she had honored his. Life wasn't perfect, and people made mistakes, but it was never too late to choose love over fear, connection over isolation. Back home, Daniel framed a photo of him and his mother, taken on his graduation day. Beneath it, he placed a note he had written, "To the woman who taught me strength, to the man who showed me forgiveness, and to the future I'll build with both in mind." As he stepped back to admire it, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for where he had come from, but for where he was going. And so, the story of James Crawford, Emily Carter, and Daniel came full circle. It wasn't a tale of perfect endings or fairy tale resolutions, but it was real. It was messy, painful, and beautiful. All the things life should be. For Daniel, the lesson was clear. We carry our past with us, but we don't have to let them define us. Instead, we can use them to shape something better for ourselves and for those who come after us.